I grew up in Albemarle County, Jordy in Charlottesville City. But we were the same age. We graduated high school at rival high schools the same year. But we've done a few projects prior to this one together. This project came about because I had shown some films on VPM prior and had a relationship with them, and they reached out to me right as everything shut down for COVID. So this is like March of 2020, and they were looking to do a project and wondered if I had any ideas, and Jordy and I had been talking about this one for quite some time because the story that we heard about Vinegar Hill in Charlottesville that we have heard more recently was just that it was an African-American neighborhood that was destroyed. It was all about its destruction. We knew that there were folks that still lived in Charlottesville that had lived in Vinegar Hill, and that there was so much more to that story, the life that occurred in Vinegar Hill. So we kind of, it worked out when VPM reached out that this was the project that we decided to work on.
And this was the first film that we worked on together. Lorenzo, of course, has a tremendous background in film, and that was actually our first point of contact. I think we were working on an oral history project at the African American Heritage Center in Charlottesville, and Lorenzo was one of the filmmakers for that project. And then he's also an extraordinary photographer, and this was at the time where there was a lot of discussion and activity around these Jim Crow era statues, both here in Richmond and Charlottesville and elsewhere. And in Charlottesville in particular, there was a group of people who were houseless that was their main park, was the Robert E. Lee Park in downtown Charlottesville. And that's where they sat, but nobody was talking to them about what they thought and what their feelings were in coming into contact and being in proximity for this statue. And so we spent a lot of time. We spent a couple months, and witnessed a lot of very, poignant memories in that time period. That was leading up to that summer of 2017. And so that was another project right at the beginning of COVID. As this project became more tangible, we were also working on something called the Determine series, which looked at social determinants of health and how those were playing out in Black neighborhoods in Charlottesville during the beginnings of the pandemic. And there are a couple of others, but those were some of those first relationship building kind of projects that we really worked on. But as Lorenzo said, we knew all the same places, we knew some of the same people, just growing up in the same area, and that really builds, I think, a firm foundation and structure for where you can then go. And it's been nice to see him kind of take on these bigger and different projects since this film's release. And now we're talking about even, what will bring us back together in terms of that next project for us and how we're gonna, tackle that and that sort of thing too.
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is, I don't need any more convincing about reparations. I've heard a lot of, and read a lot, and learned a lot, and it seems like there's a lot of different categories of reparations. There's financial, there's social, there's what level of government it would be, from the federal, for the state, the local. You did an excellent job of telling the stories of people, which I think is what will move other people. What's the plan to share this more widely than a small group of people in a Library of Virginia auditorium? Because I think these stories need to be heard more. I think that's imperative.
Thank you. Yeah, we've done a lot since the film's release. A lot of screenings like this all over the state. It is broadcasting on PBS nationally. And then we do a lot. Jordy, thank you. Thank you. And Jordy and I also do a lot of screening and speaking in schools and university classrooms and that sort of thing. The last 2 years, we've been screening this film and doing Q&As with the University of Virginia, as well with local government officials from all over the country. They come to UVA for this training session, and part of that is watching the film.
And these are, city managers, city attorneys, people working, everywhere from Vermont to Houston, Texas to Michigan. I mean, all over the country are coming. So, and they all have points of resonance, right? Where they say, oh, this reminds me of this, so this is not a uniquely Charlottesville story in that sense. And so it I think has those legs and builds on that. I think your question is the one that we wrestled with at the end of the film as well, is where does this go from here? We're not community organizers, we're not politicians, we're not lawmakers or people to take that next step, but we are receipt keepers and we are storytellers, and we can definitely make sure that that history stays preserved and that the history is accurate, and that next iteration, that next step is then positioned well on a bedrock of actual truth. I think that's certainly our role. But it is a question that we constantly get in these kind of, discussions where I think there is a very clear line of logic and evidence that there is an injustice here that is outstanding. And in fact, I think today marks 14 years, November 7th, since the city of Charlottesville apologized for Vinegar Hill. And yet we have no park, there's no signs. The only sign that was there is actually now gone because of construction. And so, in some ways there has been no movement over the last 14 years, but it has yet to see, it is the most discussed and most I think, just talked about neighborhood in Charlottesville still, in terms of when you think about injustices and patterns of behavior that are still evident today, that is still very much in people's awareness. And so I think there's still an urge and a desire to do more, but the question really is, who and what. And so one of the things we do is stay in touch with people that we talk to for the film, and they certainly have ideas about, memorialization, whether that's a physical monument or whether that's land and space, but also in terms of repair, of how to make that right to homeowners and renters alike. And so those conversations are going. They have to occur, relatively slowly just to build on each other, but they are occurring.
Your film, excuse me, was just so wonderful. My husband and I traveled here from out of state to come see the screening in person, because we could tell that it was something special when we saw it on the Library of Virginia's website. So hats off. I would take this off having a bad hair day. But if I wasn't, I would give my hat off to you for a wonderful, wonderful documentary. I am a proud HBCU graduate, Hampton University. Shout out, anybody Hampton? And I also got my graduate degree from the University of Virginia. And that was interesting because a lot of people just couldn't believe that there was this place called Vinegar Hill that just didn't exist. And they somehow thought that we as Black people, Black students, were just kind of making something up, like it was our imagination. 2 years ago this fall, I went to a conference at the Jefferson School in Charlottesville. And we broke up into small groups. And I promise you there is a question here. But this is important though. We broke up into small groups, 3 people groups. I was with two Caucasian people and myself. And I talked about the massive the lady looked at me and she said, "That really happened in Virginia?" And I said, "Yes." And the lady said, "I just retired. I taught history in Virginia public schools for 35 years, and I've never heard of the massive resistance." And then she asked the guy in the group to make sure that I was telling her something that was true. But then to her credit, she said to the entire room when we got out of breakouts and went back to the group, she announced to the room, "How can this be that I taught history in Virginia for 35 years and never knew anything about massive resistance?" And the entire room did kind of a collective shoulder shrug. And a lot of people talked about there's this disbelief that nobody believes things like massive resistance. Nobody believes that there were places like Vinegar Hill that existed, or Hayti in my mother's hometown of Durham, that don't exist anymore. So I said all that to say to you, again, kudos for a brilliant film. And the question for you is, how much pushback do you get as you are out there making sure that this history isn't lost? Are people saying to you, it's not as bad as you thought it was, or, oh, did that really happen? What is your experience for both of you in that?
Thank you so much, and thank you for traveling here to see the film. We greatly appreciate it. To answer that question, I think I have to go, for me, outside of the making of this film. I think for us, we haven't really received pushback when it comes to the making of this particular film. But in other work, that definitely occurs from time to time. Some years ago, I was conducting research as I was making another film, right, called Albemarle's Black Classrooms. And that film tells the story of the history of education for African Americans in Albemarle County, Virginia, from emancipation up to the present. And in the process of making that film and doing that research, I was uncovering how some of the schools in Albemarle County came about and whom was leading them and that sort of thing. And at one point I ended up doing a presentation to the school system. I did it in a couple of schools, and then they asked me to do it to the school system. And it was called History is the Present. And it talked about the naming of some of the schools that are named after slave owners, that are named after all types of different people. And that kicked off this school naming review in Albemarle County, and a lot of the names have been changed since then. But there was a lot of pushback there from various community members and that sort of thing. You know, you're called all types of different things on radio shows and in the media and that sort of thing. But, you know, it happens, and the work continues regardless, right? So with stuff like that, you definitely do get pushed back from time to time. But just, you know, being steadfast and knowing what you know, right? You've done the research, you know the history, you know the people who've personally experienced this history, right? We know what's true, right? And, you know, there's no getting around that.
That's so true. And that school name did change. I think the other thing we've encountered is a resistance to this more full and robust narrative that we've compiled with the film, is that people often would have this, I mean, the propaganda worked, right? So people would think of Vinegar Hill as this slummed place. And there's no accident why they would think that, right? That is what the city chose to focus on, was this select small minority of properties that were not kept up. And they often will leave out the fact that it was a white slumlord who maintained those properties in that way. But you know, we've talked to black and white people who are in their 70s and 80s and who remember Vinegar Hill, and that is still a narrative they have a hard time letting go, because that is one thing that they have grown up with, and I think that's across the board, is this reluctance to kind of accept a more full version of what you may have learned early on in your learning, and you know, there's nothing like a whole line of oral histories and kind of lived histories, as Lorenzo said, but also just the receipts of looking at the documentation and what actually took place to change people's minds. And some of those government groups that we do, we'll occasionally hear, people trying to look for a reason why the government might have done this, right? As a way to try to, justify it, and of looking for, what could possibly excuse this sort of action. And so we'll need to have kind of a more detail-oriented conversation in those sorts of circumstances. But I think most, by and large, they eventually kind of come to terms with the fact that, what's underlying this is a severe generational racism that is pervasive at all levels in government and municipal action. And so how that shows up is very different in different places, but there is a constant through line through it all.
It's hard to argue period, right, with the elders. And, there's things that were put in textbooks. There were a whole lot of things that were not put in textbooks. But one thing that we realize is that our elders, many of them are still here with us that lived these experiences firsthand. So we lean into that as much as possible.
Okay, I think it's me. Hi, I'm back here.
Oh,
Thank you both. So I guess I'll make a comment and then I'll go into my question. And that is, I think often about, like when I'm thinking about the policies around the dispossession of Black land, the fact that like this tells a story of it. Thank you. But also the instances, for example, if we look at rural land in the South, right, like post-emancipation, I think it's Black farmers had about 19 million acres of land, and today it's about 3 million acres. And then compound that with, I would say, maybe Black property owners who own like waterfront property, right? And so when we're telling these stories from, I think, the different landscapes throughout the United States, again, it's really hard to calculate the amount of loss. And so I guess my question is, have you all ever considered, or maybe I'm planting the seed, to sort of tell that story through the different lenses? Because I think, Black farmers, Black earth workers probably have a different perspective and tell the story in a different way of what it looked like to lose land in rural parts of Virginia, throughout the South, and sort of like how that disrupted community ecosystems.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's definitely a very important part of this story. And personally, I love rural stories. I grew up in rural county. That is something that we're interested in. I also recently did a film called Cash Crop, and that's also on PBS, and it's a short. But that film follows one particular African-American tobacco farmer in Southside Virginia, Lunenburg County. And in that film, we talk a little bit about how land over time has been consolidated, how much more difficult it is for tobacco farmers. And this farmer's name is Cecil Shell, and Mr. Shell they've been tobacco farming for 3 generations, and he's still on the same property that his grandfather owned. And he's been able to acquire more property over time, but many of the Black tobacco farmers in that county are no more, right? He is, the last one. So yeah, Cash Crop. But yeah, more stories like that tell that story from a rural perspective is super important.
Yeah, and you mentioned beachfront. I was just down in Hampton, actually, because of the Bayshore Hotel. Has anybody heard of the Bayshore? So a couple folks, Bayshore, from my understanding, emerges out of several Hampton faculty and administrators opening up a hotel that becomes in the early 20th century, essentially, the Atlantic City of the South. It is a destination, but it's exclusively for Black patrons. And so it creates this ecosystem around it of restaurants and nightlife, palm readers, all sorts of beachfront activity is happening in and around there. And then it's a series of combination of storms that hit it with high interest rate loans to rebuild, as well as the federal government through different loan programs, the small banking administration, amongst others, that really hamstring the administration and the people that oversee the Bayshore, and so it shutters in the 70s. But it has this almost centennial history and legacy as being this prized black beachfront property and destination, really, for all folks in Virginia and up and down the East Coast. That is exactly the story of the same dispossession that you reference, but occurring in a different way, right? It's not through eminent domain, but even that has come up in Lorenzo and I's discussions about, okay, we know that there's a larger story, not only nationally, but essentially in Virginia. We have a good friend that grew up in Farmville, and you have Longwood University right there that took over family property, and especially his family goes back many generations there, the Griffins and the Reeds, and they have the very exact same story. So I think universities are constantly complicit in this activity as well, and how that looks and shapes cities and the landscape is very different than, say, municipal governments. But obviously, one of the big aha moments was when I think it was Rob Nelson told us that this happened in 500 different municipalities as far away as Alaska and Puerto Rico. Right, and that just shows you the scale and the scope, and that's just through urban renewal, through a federal program. You're talking about all these other ways and mechanisms that are just as valid and just as nefarious in dispossession. And I think that opening that scope for storytelling and filmmaking documentation is really powerful, and absolutely is the way that we should go, for sure.
Jordy and Lorenzo, I've been a cheerleader for this film. We've shared it in schools in North Carolina and Virginia and several other states over the last couple of years. And I wish this other gentleman hadn't left, because I would have liked to have known. So for those of you that don't know, Virginia has new history standards. We fought very hard. It took years, much longer than any other normal cycle to get these things approved. But urban renewal and redlining are now part of the state curriculum at multiple grade levels. So every middle and high school student will have an opportunity to learn this history. But we have to make sure, as parents and grandparents, and even if you don't have kids in the public schools, they're already trying to find other ways to bury this history, as recently as last week, trying to change the types of assessments to move us back towards more drill and kill, more pouring facts into kids' heads instead of giving teachers and kids the time to breathe and do really good in-depth projects around topics like this that kids actually want to learn about. So I'm just curious, knowing that you guys have kids, right? How do you feel that something you made will now be part of a statewide curriculum, and other states are looking at the Virginia standards? So I think this film will trickle into other states as we continue to push for more honest and truthful and complete history. So I'm just curious, your thoughts on that as both parents and also now filmmakers.
Thank you, Annie. For me, I have two boys. One is going into middle school next year. One is coming out of middle school, going to high school next year. When we were in school, we never got any of this, right? And we grew up in Charlottesville, which means between 6th grade and 12th grade, you go to Monticello 52 times, right? Over and over. And you get a certain kind of history, especially in those times, right? There, over and over again. So it's super important to me that my children, that Jordy's children will be able to get some of this history in school, even as I go to, parent-teacher conferences and stuff like that for my kids. And they're like, hey, we taught such and such. We saw your film, and it's like, okay, good. Like, the work that we're doing is getting somewhere, and the next generation is actually getting what we didn't get.
And we actually got the opportunities to screen it for the entire 7th grade of all of Albemarle County's public schools. So we're talking, probably easy 1,000 kids over the course of 2 days in Charlottesville. So.
I would like to first commend you for the work. I think it was exceptional, and the narrative really didn't just tell the story, but it led through the psychology and the strategy behind what was done. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I lived through the 60s and urban renewal, and there were certain connections that I now understand from watching this documentary in the context of what I was experiencing and what I witnessed. Black communities that were vital, uprooted for urban renewal. What I commended in terms of Charlottesville was the creation of residential environments that were single family. I witnessed high-rise developments that not only displaced people, but brought in people that were not part of that community and changed the environment altogether. You've raised a real interesting challenge in terms of your children, younger generations. How do we continue to tell the story? Because what I'm witnessing now is that this strategy really came after the violence of displacements of Rosewood and other communities across the country that were violently destroyed in order to take what was of really black wealth. And then the strategy of urban renewal, classifying black communities as slums, as ghettos, as a justification that we need to come in and clean it up. And now I see gentrification coming in as the new strategy into black communities to say, well, again, they're not using the term slum, but they're coming in implying that they're slums. How do you see this story narrative going forward to the younger generation, to hear it and to own it in the context of what is really being done, and how do we take back the narrative in terms of securing a space for us to continually move it forward? That to me is a challenge as a person, personally, owning property and trying to see how I can pass it through to my children generationally. But how do you find a response when you're dealing with sharing the story? Because now that they know, they have to act like they know. And so when you know better, you're supposed to do better. So how do we see that being manifested, and how do you see this narrative taking root? Because it's a urban renewal story that is national. It's not just here. And I'm glad that it's here that we're telling it, but it can be tied to a national narrative as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think the process takes time, right? We've, through us and other filmmakers and other writers and journalists, not only telling this story, but telling other stories, and then therefore, for instance, the work that Annie is doing, where we are kind of reshaping, right, how we teach, what we teach, and it takes time, so that at some point, that next generation has this information, and they are the folks that are the leaders in local government that are making certain decisions, right? Empowering that next generation. Jordy and I recently spent a lot of time with Charlottesville High School students, seniors. So we spent a day there, and we screened the film for all the seniors. And then afterwards, those students wrote letters to City Council on various different topics that they wanted to see change in. So I feel like if we do more of that, it'll take some time, but we can get there.
Yeah, Lorenzo and I, we text constantly, and I'm sure it he never stops hearing from me about how this kind of narrative is continuing to play out today, but just using different terminology, different language, with city development, especially of how decisions get made and who is making those decisions and who is being listened to. You know, one thing we've, I think, become more and more attuned to is the strong lineage of the collective. Instead of, you know, when you're telling a story, it's easy to settle on an individual narrative because our brains kind of metabolize that a little bit easier. But the truth is that none of us is here by our own doing, right? That we are all product, for better and worse, of a collective, and that is where change finds itself being propelled forward the most, is when collectives can move something forward. And so, you know, for instance, there's a law in Virginia that was passed saying that there could be no unionizing, there can be no labor organizing on behalf of state employees. And that law originates after a group of black hospital workers form a union at the University of Virginia Hospital in the 1940s and 50s. And they successfully form a union, but they also bargain for fair wages and better hours and all of the things that should be mandated under basic human rights elements. But this is that movement that originates out of a collective, and they are off the job protesting, right? They're shutting down the workplace and threatening lawsuits. They're doing all of the right things in terms of moving it, but it is a direct result of those progressive actions that the State General Assembly the next year passes a law saying that actually it's illegal to do this on any level, right? And that is why that is a conversation that is still being had to this day. And so this is in the 40s and 50s, it's still with us. But so I don't know that, yes, I think that it increasingly gets better. I do think that modalities change of how people are attacking it. And how do you explain that to that next generation to say, okay, this is how it showed up in this era, but it's going to shift. It's going to change the language and shift in terms of how and when it moves, but it's still going to be there. You have to watch for it. And I think that's why those conversations with government officials is so meaningful for us, is that we can have those in-depth conversations in a very safe place that isn't public, that is meaningful in the way that they take that message back home and they make what may seem like seemingly, you know, innocuous decisions, but they make it through the lens of, oh, this is a pattern of behavior that I'm trying to correct for, right? That I need to make that extra step towards reaching out to different communities and really listening on a deeper level. That's ideally the conversation that then gets had, but you know, that's a tall order. And so I see it happening again and again in different elements, in different ways, as I'm sure everybody here probably does as well. And it's, you know, there's no, you know, we'll keep telling stories, we'll keep making films, trying to analyze and really unpack it in different ways. But I do think that there's a through line from this era that is still very much present.
I just want to say thank you again. I've come to a few of the events connected to this series, and I'm just so impressed. One of the takeaways from today is my ceiling is my son's floor. It's really moving, and the idea of not being able to continue to say that my ceiling and my son's ceiling is their floor. Another was just from a talk at the symposium, the anatomy of erasure. And I heard again the woman from the Jefferson historical talking about erasure again. And I think the past harms, bringing with us that story, the history of past harms as we move into the future. Urban planning is all about future planning. I work for the regional Planning District Commission, and as a community engagement person, I'm not a planner, but you know, the career trajectory of folks who hear these stories and then may consider urban planning as a career choice so that they can be a part of writing or moving forward without reproducing similar patterns of practice, I think is so critical. Do you feel like the urban planning students that are in Charlottesville or in Durham, wherever, you know, do you find that they connect to this story in a way that maybe could be part of the future solution? I mean, you mentioned Harlan Bartholomew, which I also learned about in another talk. I mean, architect of over 500 comprehensive plans that were to address the Negro problem. I mean, my head is just, it's been such an amazing experience for me as someone who works in the urban planning space, not as a planner, but I'm curious about that aspect of this film and whether or not you intended for future urban planners to hear the story as well, current and future.
I mean, I'll say that the group that I mentioned, that Jordy and I have been screening with at UVA, that group is interesting because, yes, they leave with kind of an aha moment. The great thing about that particular group, which we really enjoy screening to that group, is not only that they're watching the film, but because they're having these amazing conversations between them. So it's more than just Jordy and I presenting the film. Once they're watching it, someone is, one person has an opinion, someone else has an opinion from a completely different city or another side of the country, and they have these really vibrant conversations among themselves, where they're kind of dissecting the movie and convincing one another of different things, and explaining, this is what the experience was in my city versus another city. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, in that space of, local government and urban planning, seeing the film and having an aha moment. And I think for me, if you have that aha moment and you're able to take that one nugget back with you to just allow you to see things a little bit differently, because if not, the job is the job. There's someone in the job before you. The folks that are in those positions now were not here when this story occurred, so it's very easy to, continue things as they were because it's work. But if you're able to see the film and then, take that small nugget back and allow you to kind of look at things a little bit differently, it can begin to create that change.
I join with the others in commending you for a remarkable film. As a Midwesterner, there were many stories, not similar to this by any means, but I love your storytelling because I think life in many respects is a story. What is totally stunning to me in this film is the fact that after the destruction of this community, that it laid fallow for 50 years. So help me understand, what was the logic for the hurry to destroy the community? Was there a logic in that sense? Or how could the community justify the destruction and have the property sit there empty for 50 years? I'm at a loss to understand that.
I think Jordy is best to, Jordy can break this down very well,
So if you're familiar with Charlottesville, this community of Vinegar Hill is adjacent to what is now our downtown mall. It's a pedestrian mall built in the 70s, but at that time it's a two-way street. It's Main Street. It is where all the white businesses are. As you move down Main Street, it begins to move into Vinegar Hill. So Vinegar Hill was also on Main Street, but that was where the black businesses were. And as you saw in the film, there are 29 black-owned businesses. They gross $1.6 million. And so you're quite right. How do you justify that? The propaganda that the city and the Chamber of Commerce, the League of Women Voters, the Democratic Party, the architecture school at the University of Virginia, everybody was in concert around building a convention center on that land that was a black neighborhood and black business district. At this same exact point in time, there is an outdoor shopping center that's being built about 1.5 miles west. It's technically over the city boundary, so it's in the county, and it's called Barracks Road, if you're familiar with that name. It is set to gross $11 to $13 million the first year in tax revenue for the county, and the city sees that and feels very threatened. because that is money that it will not see. There's not a robust revenue sharing agreement at this point in time. And so the city says we need to build a parkway from Barracks Road all the way to the downtown business district, the white downtown business district, right? And that parkway begins to be built along Preston Avenue. And as it's being built, it takes beautiful hallmark institutions like the Carver Inn, which Lorenzo just produced a short film about as well. The Carver Inn is where Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald and huge names would come and stay. It was the premier black hotel in Charlottesville. That is destroyed and forced to move as a result of widening a road to make a parkway, essentially from Barracks Road all the way to the downtown area. So Vinegar Hill, the propaganda plans that they tried to shop was to build a convention center. So that included a hotel, a giant kind of arena, a big outdoor space, parking, all of these different elements. So they consolidated 158 properties into 7 properties. And there's a group of black business owners that said, can we at least get first right of refusal on these properties that you're condemning and you're seizing? And the answer that the city gave back to them was quite literally, well, that would be illegal because it would be racist. We can't give you, right? This is that double standard that they are then complicit in. And so the mere fact that you're consolidating 158 properties into 7, the price of those properties then goes exorbitantly up. So who could afford it? It turns out nobody, because the first property that's built is 10 years later, and it's a Virginia building. It's a state employment office that is being built. And it's not even like a daily use building, it's admin for the Central Virginia region. And then by and large, it stays relatively empty until the early 80s, late 70s. And then you see the second property be built as the Omni Hotel, which they had to give the Omni, I think, a 99-year lease for $1 in order to make the cost of the land effective enough for them to build their hotel. The next building, big building, is the federal courthouse, right? So these are all very subsidized properties that they're being built. But again, who are they subsidizing for, right? And so this pattern continues. In our youth, it was a grocery store, there was McDonald's, there were a couple things. We did a GIS analysis of the space, and it turns out 70% of the area is now parking lot. And to this day. And it's not used, right? We tried to hold the screening there, and the people that own it were like, no, we don't want. We're like, but what? Why? You're not using it. And they're like, but no, we don't want anything. Anyway, so it's perplexing, but it is privately held now. And questions circle in my mind about eminent domain and under what circumstances would the city be able to seize that land back. You see in Portland, Oregon, they just settled, I think, an $8-9 million lawsuit against people who were forcibly displaced through urban renewal. And it's a start. That's not even nearly probably what they should have gotten, but it is a start. And it sets precedent of cities, accepting responsibility, acknowledging the complicitness with which that reside. So we'll see. But yeah, that whole area, that is the kind of the sequence of events that led to that. At the end of it, they didn't move any of the white businesses. They didn't move any of the white neighborhoods. Right? There could have been a whole lot of other decisions that were made as a result of that. One thing we kind of touch on just briefly is the white high school that is built, which is now the county office building, is built in 1938, and that is on top of 16 black homes. And that's an area known as Pearl Street, and that's essentially Vinegar Hill North, right? That's just the north neighborhood. So this is a pattern. This is time enduring. But
this will be our last question.
Yeah, good afternoon. Great job, gentlemen. Stafford. My question is, as a filmmaker about to launch a documentary, how do you all stay resilient? Like, what do you do to keep yourselves going when you see the information, but then you have to come back to regroup? Or what do you do to regroup? But how do you remain resilient to keep yourselves going with your process?
I think that's a great question. Great question. For me to keep myself resilient, it's really leaning into the elders. Leaning into the elders, leaning into the folks that are the interviewees in these films. I often say, when it comes to like, is the film successful or not, if it's considered successful or not, I think for me, if an elder, like you saw Miss Kathy Johnson Harris in the film with the aerial shot at the Wendy's, right? for this film. If Miss Kathy says we did a good job, then we did a good job. So I grew up, storytelling for me comes from spending time with grandparents, sitting at my grandmother's feet while she's reading the Bible. And I'm asking her to tell me stories of the olden days, is what I called it. So she would tell me all these stories of going to school and walking to school, all those types of stories, right? So today, telling these stories is really kind of going back to those stories and filling in the blanks and learning more about them. So again, it's always for me just leaning into the elders. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say very similarly, you know, one of my favorite moments in making this film was discovering that Joaquin Wynn's grandparents lived in Vinegar Hill, and finding a photo of their home, finding the records of their home, the first property deed that they bought, and reaching out to him with Lorenzo and him not knowing that, right? And so that you're making this connection, you're repairing this broken link that he should have that access to that knowledge. And all of a sudden, because of the path we're on, we're able to support that knowledge journey for him. And then, you know, his position as a realtor, he has a different perspective on it, and he's able to then pass that to his children who are growing businessmen themselves. And just seeing that one piece of a family history, you know, while part of a larger story, is really significant for families. And so leaning into that purpose of, you know, it's storytelling for storytelling's sake, sure, and history is important, absolutely, but it's also people's lives. And so as Lorenzo was talking about, that these are very, very dear people and events and places to families, and how do you position yourself in that, you know, as just an observer, but also as the facilitator of that story, I think is really powerful. And the other thing is, you know, Lorenzo and I would probably be hanging out with or without a film, right? So, so it's nice to like the people that you work with, I think, is the other key point, is that it makes working, you know, we had a lot of like, it wasn't exactly, I wouldn't describe it as like fun, but it was invigorating, because you were alive in this process of making and unearthing this thing that we'd caught bits and pieces of our whole lives, but nobody definitively could say this is what happened. And so piecing those puzzles, you know, those pieces together was really quite powerful. But to be able to do that with somebody that you really understand and think well with, I think is really powerful as well.
Jordy and I kind of, thank you. I was just going to say that even when we're not making a film, you know, it'll be months and months, right, in between films and that sort of thing. But on a daily basis, our text chain is like, guess what I found? Like, you're not going to believe this. Check out this. And Jordy's sending me like archival documents from the 20s, and he's found this one sentence that makes some sort of like very important connection. But yeah, that's what
Lorenzo's the only person that would understand it. And it's like, see why this is.
Thank you.
Thank y'all so much.